Hello, I thought I would go through a bunch of topics in this video. They're all big enough to warrant their own, but maybe trying to squeeze a lot in will help me be a bit more brief than I usually am. I am sorry for how long these videos always go on. So there's quantum FUD around, I'll address that. People worried about quantum computers again. There's the CAT soft fork proposal that I've been wanting to address for ages. There's also BIP 110 or 444. We'll see. Shouldn't need to be much of an update on that. More tomfoolery on the mailing list. That sort of relates to the CAT. And more stuff about xpubs, Electrum, and Samurai and stuff. So I'll start there, carrying on from the last video. So after my last video, Keon, apologies if I pronounce it wrong, his wife interacted with me a lot on Twitter. We had a long back and forth last Sunday, and obviously I don't want to make her life any more difficult. I'm sorry she's in the position she's in. It must be horrible. I've never been in a situation like that where a loved one is being carted off to jail for a long time. It's awful, and I really do sympathize with her. The wider sort of samurai defending community, I still believe, doesn't really want to take and own the embarrassing aspects of the case and get through it and process it all. They would still just rather sweep it under the rug. And I find that disappointing, and it lessens my hope that they'll be successful in being able to get the guys out. I do think that what the kind of stuff I bring up is something that I would like to get through with them rather than deny. I think that's important. Everyone knows my own personal issues with the samurai guys, and I state that openly. I know that I harbor ill feeling and ill sentiment towards those guys because of the spats I've had with them in the past and how dishonest they were. But I'm not so stupid as to let that cloud my judgment about my assessment and motivation for what actually happens to them. Like I said before, I know that they need to be freed, and I know that an awful precedent has been set with regard to money transmission or unlicensed money transmission, given the things they were doing. That's, like I've said, it's not just morally wrong, it's also going to create practical issues for people working on software in the Bitcoin space. And I'd be really short-sighted to let my own personal dislike of them get in the way of me trying to do anything here. So me bringing up the context in the conversation around Samurai is done because I think it's relevant, it's not, as it might trivially seem, working against them, trying to make it harder to get them out of jail. I don't think hiding inconvenient facts is going to be helpful in efforts to get them out of jail. I think having uncomfortable conversations and getting through them is important. And obviously, to state it unequivocally, I think that it was more likely they were pursued due to the existence of the honeypot than it is the opposite framing, which is what everyone's going with, the latter, which is their privacy software was so awesome that it meant that they annoyed the Department of Justice, who then came after them. I genuinely think if the server hadn't existed with people's xpubs on it, they would have been less likely for people to have gone after them, not more. So the framing of them being in trouble for having written privacy software that worked too well is fundamentally not accurate if there's any truth to the idea that they painted a target on their back by running a centralized operation that kept metadata about coin joins that was useful to the Department of Justice. I think that's the mistake, and it's very important for people to learn that, because you don't want to paint a target on your back if you're doing the kinds of things they were doing, the admirable work of trying to make Bitcoin more private. Anyone engaging in that should be careful not to paint a target on their back, because if they sufficiently annoy the DOJ and the DOJ is prepared to bend its own rules going after those people so that it can put them in jail, that will create a precedent that will spook the entire space. And you can say it makes things better maybe because now the remaining coin joining solutions in Bitcoin are most likely just better than that. and more decentralized, that's, yeah, you can say that's a silver lining here, but it comes at the massive cost of just scaring people away from working on it altogether. So people need to be aware of the fact that if you're doing something that you're getting away with, and it's an important thing that the state probably doesn't love, but they're leaving you alone, don't paint targets on your back by running servers that will be very useful to them, or by, hurling derogatory statements at them on social media and asking them to come after you, thinking that you'll be immune because of freedom of speech. If you do that and they do come after you, not only do you lose your freedom potentially, but other people get implicated in what you're doing when they might have just been able to sail under the radar. It's like, I'm sure everyone can imagine an analogous situation where there's a rule, we all break the rule, but we don't go overboard with it. We don't have any moral issue with breaking the rule, but we all know that if we get stupid and we start going too far with it, then the whole shindig is going to come collapsing down under its own weight. If you're going to break a rule, don't break it to the point where you invite retaliation from the corrupt authorities that enforce it, because everyone loses when you do that. And sadly, according to comments on my last video, which I obviously didn't realize at the time, and it's important to add it here, even if they get a presidential pardon, it's not going to undo the precedent now. So my own selfish motivations that I keep alluding to for wanting to get them out of jail are undermined massively by that. And I think it's true, unfortunately. So even if Trump came along and pardoned both of them, it's still now a way more risky thing to do, especially if you're an American, to work on CoinJoin software or non-custodial wallets because of what happened in that case. And there's no undoing that. So I do believe Samurai's behavior was not just a tragedy for their own personal lives, but it's somewhat made life more difficult for everyone. And I don't even know if there's a way to undo that damage. I'm not a lawyer. I don't understand the American legal system well enough to speak on it further than that. But it's a shame. Everything about that situation is a shame. And hopefully, the funny thing is, I believe Samurai had somewhat of a death wish, and that got granted to them. But I can't exactly claim to be any better, because engaging in this topic results in nothing but people coming after me and attacking me. They just can't fathom the fact that because I personally dislike them and because I had a spat with them, that I must be motivated. I must have, cruel intentions here and want them to go to jail. I really don't. I am sincere in saying that no one should ever be imprisoned for unlicensed money transmission. It's just wrong on every level, and it means that we can't have money on a philosophical level. If money always requires the permission of some licensing infrastructure to move around, then what's the point of having money? There's too much friction for it to do the job money's supposed to do. That's the philosophical angle. And the practical angle is that Bitcoiners need to be using money in a permissionless way. And anything that starts creating legal precedent and barriers for people that want to make that possible, or for people that just want to do it themselves, is very unnerving. And I hope not to see it increase. Hopefully this is the end of it. Most likely scenario is they do spend, I think it's 4 years for Will and 5 years for Keon in jail. Most likely scenario is they do that. From what I've been led to believe, timeout for good behavior and the way they got imprisoned is quite unlikely. So that sucks. They'll probably do most of that time and then come out. But I mean, it's not that awful, thankfully. Like I said last time, it's not double life sentence plus 40 years like they did with Ross. If it had been, we could have used that as a rationale for saying they overdid it and this was unfair and more deserving of a pardon. But unfortunately, the sentence isn't really that harsh. So it's possible that it's hard to drum up the sentiment saying this is completely unjust. I think the main thing that maintains us hope for getting them out of jail is looking for prosecutorial misconduct. Again, I'm not a lawyer and I don't understand the American legal system that well, but I think that's the best angle they really have. Finding a lawyer that looks into it and says these guys were targeted and persecuted. A lot of the things they did are done by loads of other people in the space. Coin joining is not illegal. Coordinating coin joins is not illegal. None of this is immoral activity. It's all just basic safety and as a safety practice in Bitcoin, and they've been unfairly targeted for it. If someone can make that case and use that to justify, getting them released from prison, then that probably looks like the most practical way to get them out. So yeah, I think I should, hopefully I have the intelligence to leave this topic alone now. I don't know if I actually will, but there's only one other thing really to say on it, which is the stuff that came up about xpubs. And I've been freaking out about xpubs more than most people, and this isn't specific to Samurai. People are talking about the quantum computer FUD came around again, and people say as long as you use so this is a new topic now. People say as long as you use a new address each time and you don't reuse addresses, it doesn't matter if there's a quantum computer. It was described as a long-range attack because each address gets compromised one by one, but they don't all get compromised together. You're not if you have a seed and that generates a wallet, an HD wallet that has loads of Bitcoin addresses in it, all from that one seed, they're all independent from one another. They're only linked together by the extended public key. And the extended public key, unfortunately, is something that no one really keeps private the way they keep private keys private. But in a quantum computing world, they both need to be as private keys are currently. So if your xpub becomes known by someone with a quantum computer, they know all of your private keys. So again, that means your private key, your xpub needs to be as private as your private keys are. And I mistakenly said yesterday that public Electrum servers are having your xpub uploaded to them. I thought they worked the way Samurai's Dojo worked. It doesn't. Samurai's Dojo works worse than things like Electrum and Trezor Suite and all the wallets people use that aren't privacy wallets. They're still not. That's the last thing I should say on the Samurai thing, is that Dojo itself is slightly worse for privacy by taking your whole xpub than just standard wallet software that doesn't claim to be privacy software like Electrum and Trezor Suite and Sparrow. So I really don't like the way Electrum works and Sparrow works and Trezor Suite work and any other Electrum server using wallet, which is basically all of them. I don't like the way they work because they very easily and usually by default connect to public Electrum servers. I said yesterday that they upload your xpub. They don't. They just upload an initial batch of addresses and then add them iteratively after that. And that's a privacy disaster because it creates linkability, right? It links address A to address B. Without you having done that, without you, a single entity, connecting to a single server and saying this set of addresses belongs to me, then they have no way of linking them apart from doing on-chain analysis. So I hate the way that works. My ideal design for all of these wallets is when you're initially setting them up, before you add a wallet, the software itself says enter the credentials for your Electrum server. And the assumption and messaging would be this should be run by you. You're going to upload an extended list of your addresses, and that is something that should be kept private for your own safety. And then you can click a button that says, I don't have my own Electrum server. And then it can say, if you'd like, you can connect to a public server. Warning, this will make an unknown third party aware of all of your Bitcoin addresses. Are you sure? None of the software does this. Sparrow does offer some warnings, but if you just proceed and you don't have an Electrum server, it will just connect to public Electrum servers. And Sparrow also offered, at least, I don't know if it still does. Let me open it up and see whether it still offers coin joining. Oh, that does seem to have been removed from. I guess there isn't really a way to do it at the moment. Maybe there is. I'm a bit confused about whether you can do stuff like that still. But anyway, for a long time you could coin join using Whirlpool in Sparrow Wallet. I think that's gone for now. But if you're connecting to public Electrum servers and you're coin joining inside your wallet, that's completely broken. I mean, it's so broken that I think I must be misunderstanding something here. Maybe Craig was clever enough to design it in such a way that all that stuff gets segregated. But at the end of the day, how can you know the balance of your addresses if you're not connected to an Electrum server? And if it's possible to, I don't think CoinJoin capability was ever disabled in Sparrow if you're not clicking a button that says, don't worry, I'm connected to my own back end. So this Sparrow, this privacy stuff in Bitcoin is just not well understood. And the protecting yourself from quantum computer, I don't think quantum computers are anywhere near being a credible threat to Bitcoiners. But when people talk about defensive strategies you can take, they betray that they don't understand the importance of xpubs. So they're not understood in the context of privacy, and in the world and in the quantum computing world, they're not understood with regard to their implications for theft. Like I said, if a quantum computer exists, your xpub is just all your private keys, so they can just steal all of your money, not on an address-by-address basis. And if you run a normal HD wallet and one of your private keys leaks and your xpub is known, I mean, this is without even quantum computers, then they can unwind all of your addresses. And that to me, I'm not super confident on that assertion, because I never see people speak about it, and I'm not a cryptographer, but I think that's how it works. So if you have a whole bunch of addresses and you're splitting your Bitcoin up into multiple addresses and one of the private keys gets leaked, now you're at the point where your xpub is the private key for everything else, because the combined knowledge of one of your private keys within a set of addresses, assuming they're all not hardened, which they never are, you're hardened all the way down to the address level, and then that's not hardened. So they're all part of the same set. The xpub that belongs to that set plus one of the private keys from that set means all of the private keys can now be known in a classical computing capacity, not a quantum computer. So yeah, I'm telling people xpubs need to be private, and it's not just a quantum computing thing, because obviously I don't really believe they're a credible issue, but it's a privacy thing, and people are quite slapdash with it. Having your xpub on an internet-connected device is not really very dangerous with regard to theft, not until quantum computers exist. But the implications for your privacy are pretty serious, and I really wish wallet software would stop allowing users to take shortcuts. This was why Spectre was my favorite desktop wallet for years. It fell into disrepair, which is really sad, because I liked it so much, but it wouldn't work unless it picked up a Bitcoin node running on the same machine, and if it couldn't do that, you'd have to input credentials for a Bitcoin node manually. Now, this was a nightmare because Electrum servers are quick. They index all the addresses, and that allows you to find out your balance on a newly uploaded or imported wallet in a couple of seconds. Whereas Spectre, if you uploaded a wallet into it, would take hours, if not over a day, to claw through the whole chain trying to figure out how many Bitcoins you had. That sucks, but you only do that once or twice, hopefully. In practice, it ends up happening all the time. But in that context, just that design choice was very clever. Spectre eventually added Electrum, but it was done in a fairly smart way where you could connect it to your own, and I don't know if it forced you the same way it did with nodes. I don't think it reached out to public servers. So again, they maintain that good design choice. And the fact that Electrum has been around forever, it's so old, but it's still, by default, when you fire it up, will connect to random servers and tell them, hey, this guy's connecting to you, and here's a bunch of his addresses. That is not good enough. And it needs to stop. It's a poor practice, it's poor design, and it undermines users' privacy. If you're using your own wallet, and it's an import of your own private keys stored on your own cold storage, your expectation is that your activity is all private until you're doing anything on chain, and then it's your job to be careful. But that's different. But if your own monitoring tools on your own computer are leaking information about combinations of addresses that belong to you, that's a problem, and that needs to be something users can't do by accident. So the whole xpub conversation The understanding is simply just not there. In quantum computing world, it's all of your private keys. In classical computing world, if it ever gets leaked, your privacy is all gone. And while I made a mistake in yesterday's post where I was saying that xpubs are, uploaded to random Electrum servers, they're not, just chunks of it are. The implications for privacy remain. If you upload batches of addresses from one entity, one IP address, or whatever it is you're connecting from, that's going to create problems for you. Even if you use Tor, it's going to create problems for you because you're still under one identity when you send a batch of addresses. So anyway, that's all the xpub stuff. Treat your xpub with caution. It needs to be private, even though the word public is in it. So next, let's talk about. One other thing to mention with the quantum FUD is a lot of people are saying it's like a psyop. Let's bring up the quantum FUD again to get everyone to stop talking about the cat or BIP 110 or anti-spam stuff, and it could be, but I don't really think so. Another thing I'd like to point out and pat the anti-spammers on the back a little bit for is that I don't believe in the quantum FUD at all. I have zero fear that Bitcoin is going to be compromised due to the existence of quantum computers within multiple decades. I somewhat believe the entire field to be almost pseudoscientific at this point. Or maybe they're just faking it until they make it. I'm an optimist, so I do believe quantum computers are actually possible at some point. But I also know that people working in those industries have no incentive to ever blow the whistle on what it is they're doing. So they constantly overhype their claims and contrive scenarios where they can look like they're making progress when they're not. And they've been 10 years away forever, yada, yada, yada. I'm not particularly worried. But here's the point I want to make. Anyone that's concerned about quantum computers and is trying to harden Bitcoin against them, have at it. I'm enjoying watching your progress and I'm interested in what you're doing. I'm not going to sit here whinging at you saying, I don't think this is a particularly bad problem, therefore you need to stop talking about it. That is what keeps happening with the anti-spam people, right? So we're concerned about spam. We're trying to find solutions to it, and constantly people attack us and moan about the fact that they're not worried about spam, therefore can we just drop it? And I find that discourteous. If he who says it cannot be done should not interrupt he who is trying to do it. And people that are trying to make Bitcoin quantum resistant, I appreciate that will take many years of work to come up with something satisfactory and a lot of research, and I'm happy someone's doing it on the off chance that it ever becomes a problem. I don't think it's going to become a problem probably in my entire life, but I'm not going to interrupt the people doing it. So again, have at it. So anyway, some of the quantum, that leads me into my next topic, which is the mailing list clown show. That, it's basically just a small group of people, Brian Bishop, Warren Tagami, and a couple others that moderate the mailing list. And it seems they're very deferential to Greg Maxwell. If someone makes a post, they will, as far as I can tell, before approving it to show up on the mailing list, they let Greg look at it, write his response, establish what the Pax Greg Maxwell is, and have that immediately there to fire off as a response when they approve the initial post on the mailing list. And that sets the tone for acceptable thought with regard to whatever the proposal is, assuming it's particularly controversial, right? So they really do want to maintain the charade of the fact that the mailing list is not just a voluntary happy place where, it's not a required part of the bureaucratic process of engaging with Bitcoin as a developer, when we know it is, because that's their stated goal. And by which I mean, if you post a BIP to the Bitcoin GitHub, then if it hasn't been discussed on the mailing list, they will reject it, and they'll say they will invoke that rule and say this has not been discussed on the mailing list, therefore it's ineligible to be proposed as a Bitcoin improvement proposal, or BIP. But that implies that there needs to be a certain amount of rigorous process with how the mailing list is moderated. And that's being kicked to the side now because someone proposed the cat. I'll get into the cat soon. And the cat, is UTXO deletion, essentially. 40 or 50% of the UTXO set would be just wiped. And this was not a proposal from me or anyone in Ocean, which is what Greg is on the edge of his seat trying to assert, but has managed to contain himself somewhat so far. But anyway, I left my opinions on there. They allowed me to respond to the proposal, but they didn't allow the person that wrote the proposal to respond to any of the pushback, which is very disappointing. That person's called Claire. She wrote a response to Greg's response to her, and that got put. Eventually she gave up waiting for them, and they're definitely not going to approve it. For me, that's incredibly discourteous. It was a very well thought out proposal. It commits an ideological faux pas because it deletes a bunch of UTXOs, but the proposal is worth discussing, in my opinion. And Claire, if it wasn't, there wouldn't even be any discussion around it anyway. It would have been laughed out of the room, but this wasn't laughed out of the room. Instead, it triggered people and offended them and caused them to make some knee-jerk statements that I'm going to get into in a minute because when I offer my opinions on the cat. But anyway, Greg asserted that anyone that posts anything confiscatory on the mailing list should be banned from it, as well as anyone else that works in the same organization as them. So this is obviously everything he pushes back with eventually comes back to some sort of Ocean derangement syndrome or Luke derangement syndrome. And that's the intention here, right? It's because... But I mean, imagine the implications. So someone that might be Ocean, Claire is not anything to do with Ocean, and I'll tell you that unequivocally. And that Luke isn't even in favor of the cat. But the fact that Greg thinks Claire might be someone that posted something confiscatory, as well as BIP 110, which came from Dathan Ohm, who is also nothing to do with Ocean, but he did admittedly build on top of something Luke proposed on the mailing list. So there's some tenuous connection there. But the point is, two people nothing to do with Ocean have posted stuff to the mailing list. It's annoyed Greg, and Greg has now said, these people are probably something to do with Ocean. Ocean came up a lot during the discussion around 110 when again, Dathan Ohm is not a part of Ocean, but Ocean keeps getting dragged into the discussion. It's very annoying because 20% of the network are running knots now. So there are some technical people within that 20% that are making proposals that reduce spam, either at the policy level or the consensus level. And they're not just going to be one of the 4 or so people at Ocean that feel strongly about spam. Ocean has, easily 20 odd people working for it. It's just me, Luke, Leo, and Jason that have a strong anti-spam position. Jason hasn't commented on any of this stuff in ages. So it's mainly just 3 of us out here discussing things, and Leo doesn't ever go on the mailing list or anything like that. And so it's really just me and Luke. And there's a whole bunch of people that work for Ocean. Best example of someone that would be caught needlessly catching a stray here would be Vincenzo Palazzo, who works for Ocean. He likes to keep his head under the radar and doesn't discuss any of this controversial stuff. He's a Lightning developer. He's done a ton of work for Lightning. A lot of what Lightning is as a result of his work. Banning him from the mailing list because he works for a company that is implicated in a proposal not written by someone working for that company for a year because you're annoyed about having to respond to it, from an organ like the mailing list, which you need to be able to participate on if you're ever going to be allowed to work or, propose anything as a BIP, is just so over the top control freakish behavior that it's so... If Koto were my enemy and I was like a kid, I'd be delighted, saying, do not interrupt your enemy while he's making a mistake. But I'm not a kid. This stuff just saddens me. It makes me really... Because Greg was a hero of mine. And looking at him behaving in such a ridiculous way, I wrote a long response to his pushback on the cat, and he's written 4 responses since then, none of which addressed a single point I've made. He's only talking to other people. He's just completely ghosting what I wrote. And I called out the flaws in his arguments, which were straight up wrong. They keep asserting that anti-spam stuff is completely useless in Bitcoin and ignoring all the evidence to the contrary. And they keep committing survivorship bias by saying there is spam, therefore any anti-spam mechanisms do nothing. This is such a fallacious argument because you can't... again, on Hosted Marcellus, one of my favorite people, he made the best analogy ever with this. Someone is trying to tell you that contraception doesn't work by pointing at all the babies in the world. It's such a stupid, broken line of reasoning that it boggles the mind when you get mired in a conversation with someone saying that. It's stupider than even the statistical denials, right? It does come down into that, I'm saying that 90% conform to this set of metrics. Okay, well, or fall within these boundaries. And people say, well, what about these statistical anomalies? I'm saying, yes, they're statistical anomalies. So people point to spam filters being routed around, and I'm saying, all right, but unfortunately I don't have the bell curve. I don't have the center of the bell curve to point to, because that all is only inferred by absence. You can't look at its existence. I don't know. There are a lot of babies that weren't born because of contraception, but you have to sense their absence via indirect mechanisms. You can't look at unborn babies and say, here are all the babies that don't exist because contraception exists. That's not what it is. You're proving negatives, and you have to infer them indirectly. And that's why anti-spam mechanisms, when they work, it looks like they're not doing anything. And that's a problem when trying to have debates with disingenuous people that insist on pointing to things that must manifestly exist in a tangible way. It's very annoying. So anyway, I'm going way off topic here. The drama on the mailing list is basically, let's just start banning people from something we require them to use for our bureaucratic processes. Not much fun. It would really annoy me getting banned off the mailing list. I do appreciate them allowing me to respond to the cat. That's overly humble of me to say. I maybe should be more assertive and saying, of course they should respond and allow me to respond, because my response was really reasonable. And I'll start going into what I actually think about the cat now. So, what does the cat do? The cat trawls through the UTXO set. All right, let's even go further back than that. What are UTXOs? UTXOs are unspent transaction outputs. They are the most expensive thing in the space for a node to run. They're famously expensive, and computationally expensive, that is, because they're right there. They're not in RAM, as people have asserted mistakenly, and Greg pushed back on that in the mailing list, and that was correct, of course. But they are often kept in RAM during initial block download, which is something we're striving to make faster, and it's one of the issues, the fact that initial block download gets harder every time a new block is found, and it does so, it outpaces Moore's law and its ability to keep up with the lengthening of the chain, right? That's one of the sad things. It keeps getting longer to sync the chain, even though computers keep getting more powerful. So the UTXO set, you can keep it in RAM during IBD. You can keep the entire thing in RAM if you're able to do that, and then IBD will fly by, because as you validate new blocks, as you trawl through them, if you can grab from RAM the spent UTXOs that show up in new blocks as you download them, that's quicker than reading them off of a disk. And not having to write them to disk constantly is faster as well. So keeping stuff in RAM is just, it makes everything a lot quicker. RAM is famously getting incredibly expensive at the moment. But the UTXO set, regardless, there's around 5 gigabytes of genuine transactions, and there's about 5 or 6. I think it's about 6 and 6. So there's about 6 gigabytes of genuine transactions, and then there's about another 6 gigabytes of UTXOs that are basically useless. They're output size 546 sats or other dust limits as they appear for different output types. So, and they're all for amounts that no one would ever spend, right? It's a 68 cent coin that it costs you 30 cents to ever spend. So people creating them aren't worried about the ability to ever spend these things, right? Remember how UTXOs work, right? It's just as expensive to spend a $1 million note as it is to spend a $1 note in Bitcoin, because it's the same amount of data. If you spend $2, as in you have two $1 bills, that's twice as much data on the input side than spending a $1 million bill. And so it costs twice as much in that regard. So this is not well understood, right? How expensive is it to spend your Bitcoins on chain? It depends how much data you're writing on the chain, not how much money you're spending. And that's not intuitively understood by people. And anyway, UTXOs can be really expensive if you have a whole bunch of them inefficiently. So if you have loads and loads and loads of tiny UTXOs, you're going to be spending a lot more than you would be if you had the same amount of Bitcoin all sitting at one consolidated UTXO. This is a big part of discussion historically in Bitcoin. SegWit famously has discounted witness data, and witness data pertains to the inputs in a transaction, not the outputs. And part of discounting witness data was to help encourage people to shrink the UTXO set by making it cheaper to have lots of inputs versus having lots of outputs. So they were saying, if you want to create a transaction that spends in $1 million bill and turns it into, $10,100 bills, that will be way more expensive than if you have $10,100 bills and consolidate it all into $1 million bill. They're trying to encourage people to consolidate because consolidation shrinks the UTXO set. Because if you have loads of UTXOs, everyone has to store that, and they store that in the chain state. And that's the 12 gigabyte folder that sits there in your Bitcoin directory. And if you're running a pruned node, it dwarfs everything else because you prune your node all the way down to 550 megabytes. That's the lowest value you can use. And if you are running a prune node, you might as well prune it all the way. I don't know why you wouldn't. So you have a Bitcoin directory. Let me just look at this. I'm sitting in my thing here. So I have a 17 gigabyte folder on this machine. 16 gigabytes of that is the UTXO set. And there's another, the blocks directory is 633 megabytes, right? 0.6 gigabytes for the blockchain, 16 gigabytes for the chain state, the UTXO set. So annoyingly, in Greg's first response to the cat, he said this is a negligible savings. And it's not. It's 90% of what makes up, of what's taking up space in your Bitcoin directory is the UTXO set. And it's all trash. And the analogy I used for it, it's not all trash, half trash. And the analogy I used for it is Bitcoin's digital cash, UTXOs are the paper, they are the bills. And instead of carrying around the paper relevant to you, you carry around everyone's cash, and you just have a tiny, infinitesimally small chunk of that paper, that stack of paper, a 500-mile stack of paper, and you've got an inch of it. You carry that around, and you're able to spend that, but you have to carry all of it in order to be able to use any of it. So the fact that 200 miles of this 500-mile stack of paper are scrawlings and scribblings of dicks and silly, immature, juvenile stuff related to crypto scamming, all of it disingenuously created in order to trick people into storing data on their own devices, and I'll get into property rights in a second because I think that's philosophically what's relevant here. It makes sense for us to say, hey, there's like 1 million Bitcoiners wandering around carrying this 500-mile stack of paper, most of which is junk. Why don't we just delete all the junk? We know what it is. It's all just graffiti and doodles, and its spending capacity is basically zero, and it was created by people who never really intended to spend it. You create a 546 sat output with an inscription attached to it because you're gambling on something external to Bitcoin. You have no reason to create an output that size. It's not economically useful. You're going to spend 20 or 30% of its value consuming it. If you carry around hundreds of pennies and every store you go to charges you 20% of each penny to be able to spend it, you'd stop doing that logically. You would instead carry around, a $10 bill instead. Because if they're still only going to charge you, a 20th of a cent to spend that, then that's way more efficient. And the assumption is Bitcoiners would do that, and that would help shrink the UTXO set, but it doesn't. It doesn't because people are using the UTXO set to stash data on other people's computers instead. So anyway, disappointingly again, I thought generally the conversation with genuine people against the cat would basically go along the lines of, yeah, all right, the UTXO set is clearly filling up with absolute trash, but it's not something we should ever do anything about because it's going to set too negative a precedent. Deleting UTXOs go too far. Obviously, we've done it before in isolated incidents like, the inflation bug. And I believe the introduction of P2SH invalidated an 100 Bitcoin UTXO, but back then 100 Bitcoins wasn't maybe the massivest deal. So for whatever reason, that was fine. It's happened a bunch of times. You can make it so that any soft fork upgrade would invalidate a UTXO by just waiting for them to define what it would be and then creating a UTXO that would become unspendable as a result of it. So if you want, you can make CTV confiscatory by making a UTXO that CTV would make unspendable. And then you control the mailing list by saying, hey, Greg, someone proposed CTV, and because of this UTXO, that would make that, they would confiscate that. So now you need to ban everyone talking about CTV on the mailing list, even though CTV is a very popular upgrade. And you can say, oh, well, it's not the same thing. The cat is straight up here for the purposes of confiscating like 40% of the UTXO set. Confiscation is the wrong word, but they're going to insist on using it. But we refuse to use discernment, right? So I think that would be a valid point to push back on it. So anyway, that's, I think I naively thought everyone would be like, okay, the UTXO set's ridiculous. It's full of absolute trash. We can all agree on that. We all agree that reducing the UTXO set would be great. We know that it was the motivation for the witness discount, yada, yada, yada. But I disagree with this idea because it goes too far. Something like that. That, to me, would have been a reasonable position. It's not far from my position anyway. And instead, what Greg did and others did was start saying, oh, it would be negligible. Reducing the 16 gigabyte out of the 17 gigabytes in your directory down to like 6 gigabytes. Making IBD eventually faster. You can't do it immediately, but it would just make life a lot easier. And it would, the main motivation for the cat, though, is not so much the resource saving for the people running nodes. It's the secondary effects that would come from it. People that want to store crap on the Bitcoin blockchain in the way that they've been doing it at the moment would have less confidence in the permanence of what they're doing, because the Bitcoin network actually showed that it can defend itself from people hijacking it to store data, and will actually start attacking what they do and making it unusable and causing them to have to find workarounds. That's going to massively undermine future spam protocols that can always just use another chain. So activity like that will result in a massive improvement of quality of life for node runners that would be very hard to perceive, because again, you're proving negatives. You're trying to say, look at all the spam that didn't happen. Look at all the babies that weren't born. It's very hard to do that. But I think it's undeniable that it would have that effect. And even talking about the cat and treating it somewhat seriously has the result of making a lot of spammers get very nervous and start moving their UTXOs around, or moving them to outputs greater than 1,000 sats just to not get catted. So it's effective. Even talking about it is effective. And that's why it's very annoying when people keep saying, you can't do anything about spam. I'm saying even talking about stuff that we could do about spam reduces spam. So constantly, tiring of the conversation and refusing to participate in it in good faith and trying to undermine it because you're bored. Again, he who says it cannot be done should not interrupt he who is trying to do it. On any protocol, you cannot prevent spam entirely, but please don't get in the way of people that are trying to make those protocols more usable and trying to reduce it somewhat, because they're doing very valuable work. And if you don't want to partake in it, just go away. The same as I agreed to do in the quantum debate. I don't think finding a workaround for the supposed reality and inevitability of quantum computers is at all interesting to me. I don't think they're a credible threat, not for forever. But I'm not going to get in your way if you're trying to do that. Okay, if you believe it's a genuine threat, go for it. I'm not going to be as cynical as others who think the whole quantum FUD conversation is just, the whales trying to make the price dump or people trying to distract the conversation from spam. I don't think it's that. I think people are genuinely concerned about quantum computers. I know that, OpenSSH is deprecating some of the libraries that rely on quantum vulnerable crypto, like people, and NIST did as well, or some institution was like, okay, we're phasing out quantum vulnerable crypto, cryptographic standards, that is, not cryptocurrencies. And I'm like, okay, fair enough. I don't mind people being overly cautious, and I'm not going to get in their way. So if people don't think spam could be countered by as little as having conversations around mitigative strategies, then just get out of the way and let the people who are okay with it discuss it. Don't start saying they should be banned and the people that work for similar companies as those you imagine to have been loosely related to one of the proposals. And stop, like, it's totally inappropriate to start getting in the way of the conversation like that. And unfortunately, if you're just saying go and use other avenues, they haven't done that yet. Like, you don't have to use the mailing list, use something else. Unfortunately, they know that's ridiculous because we have to use the mailing list to be allowed to do anything on GitHub. So anyway, I'll get into my opinions on the cat and round off the video with that. So I don't think that theft, as Greg characterized it, is an accurate description of it at all, because no one comes into possession of these tiny amounts of sats or of the data, these NFTs or stamps or whatever. No one comes into the possession of any of this stuff. None of us want it. We're just making it so that you can no longer sell it without routing around what we did in some way and, deciding that they're being sold on another, according to some other centralized database, right? Because they're using the blockchain as their centralized oracle. This has been sold. This has not yet been sold. We're deleting their ability to do that because they can't consume the UTXO and move whatever data it is that's attached to that UTXO to a new UTXO. They won't be able to do that anymore. So with stamps, that's already the case, because stamps are fake pub keys, which means they bloat the UTXO set, but they're not real UTXOs. They already catted themselves because those are all, they only half catted themselves, because sadly, they gave themselves a UTXO they could never spend in the first place, but all our nodes are still treating them as real. So we could delete them all as a cleanup measure. We could just delete all the stamp UTXOs. And this isn't undermining anyone's ownership of anything, but all it is just saying there's a bunch of UTXOs in the UTXO set that literally cannot be spent anyway. So can we just officially say that they cannot be spent so that we can move them out of this stupid folder and reduce the resource requirements here? But anyway, yeah, Greg characterized it as theft. He said this is outright theft. It's not. It's very expressly not that, because no one comes into possession of the things that are being taken. They are just destroyed. And I said it's more similar to destruction of property. And destruction of property is fine in some circumstances. And this is why I believe it's completely philosophically defensible. I think people are arguing about issues with precedent, and that's not the same as talking about going purely abstract with regard to property rights. So I'll defend it philosophically, because I cannot violate your property rights. It's your car, and it's your car sitting on your property. I can't steal it. I can't destroy it. All that is immoral. We know that. However, Bitcoin UTXOs don't work that way. Bitcoin UTXOs is your property. It's your car parked in my driveway. That's what it is, because you're expecting me to keep track of that data forever on my computer. And destruction of property that's getting in your way on your own property is very different and very justified. If you park your car in my driveway and block my garage so I can't get in and out of it, I might do you the courtesy of trying to figure out who you are and ask you to move it. I'm not going to spend particularly long waiting for that to reconcile before I destroy your freaking car, scrap it for metal, and give myself the proceeds from that. And I have no moral qualms about doing that. You are dumping crap on everyone's computers, tricking them into thinking that it's genuine, the most expensive resource consuming worthy thing in Bitcoin, and asking us to treat it as such forever. And if we collectively, I know everyone hates that word, if we collectively decide that we are no longer prepared to do this, you are dumping your trash on our property, we are getting rid of it. I have absolutely no philosophical issue with doing that. and people sensibly don't make this argument that much, but that is the retort to what Greg said. Not only is it not theft, it's destruction of property, but it's justified destruction of property. So I'm fine with that from a moral perspective. Where it becomes something where the reason I'm not out here saying activate the cat right now is different to that. It's because it's a massive list. You're talking a couple dozen million UTXOs. That's an enormous amount of things to be marking as non-monetary UTXOs or not, which is the nomenclature of the proposal. It trawls through the whole UTXO set. It uses the heuristics the spammers use and says, this is an NFT, this isn't. This is an NFT, this isn't. And it designates everything that's an NFT or some other, or a stamp or an inscription or an ordinal or whatever, and says, these are all non-monetary UTXOs. And it also places the criteria on them that they must be under 1,000 sats, because that's a sanity check that makes a lot of sense to add within that. So if you have an inscription and it's sitting at a giant UTXO, it won't get touched by the cat. The cat's more sensible than to go after those. And if spammers want to take that and say, I can just get around this by making bigger UTXOs, then they won't get catted. They can do that, but they know they're running a risk, because cat v2 might just update its heuristics to say, actually, bigger UTXOs are allowed, as long as they do this. Because the spammers are stuck. If they want any of their schemes to catch on, they need to have public heuristics for how their protocols work. Ordinals and inscriptions can't be private. The protocols by which they are established and traded are all public and open source necessarily, which means something like the cat can say, well, you're all hiding in plain sight, and I'm going to look at the criteria you use and use that as a basis for which I delete all your activity. That, if they say, all right, we got to hide from the cat, if they hide from the cat or future cats, then they become useless, and they might as well just use centralized databases, because it all becomes trust-based at that point. It ruins the whole facade of it. They can carry on doing what they're doing in an incognito, invisible capacity, but it undermines the nature of what they're doing. They need to weaponize and monetize these spam attacks, which means everything they do needs to be public. They need public participation from random people voluntarily joining in on these crazes. They can't do that if they're running a centralized private thing that puts data on Bitcoin in a way that we can't perceive and doesn't have an identifiable footprint. It doesn't work anymore. So they can still do all that, the latter approach there, but it becomes pointless for them. It ruins their motivation. So that's the intelligence of the cat. So anyway, like I said, I have no philosophical issue with removing annoying property that isn't mine off my own property. I have no issue doing that. And I think anyone with a congruent understanding of property rights can agree with that. So the practical concern around coming up with a list that big of like 30 odd million UTXOs is a concern, because that's a lot of resources chugging through it and indexing all them. But I do believe it's such a controversial proposal, and this is my favorite part about what the cat does, is it acknowledges the issue here. What happens if 3 people trawl through the UTXO set and say, right, these are all the spam ones, that's what gets deleted by the cat. How do you know your UTXO isn't in that list? Well, you have to run the whole thing yourself. And this is sort of the irony of the risk here, is the fact that it's so over the top and that you're deleting UTXOs means that a lot of people are going to come out here and be like, right, I need to verify the integrity of this list. I need to generate it myself. And I'm not in the least bit worried that if something like the cat happened, my UTXOs would end up getting deleted. I'm just not. And this is the point many people have made. And again, it comes down to precedent. And this, again, is why I'm like, when I saw the cat, I was like, nah, I don't know if I'm really in favor of this. Then I saw Greg and everyone's arguments against it, and I realized they don't have any good arguments. And they articulated my own hesitancy better than I could, and I realized my own objections are nonsense. And the primary one is, again, precedent. They're saying, if we delete a bunch of UTXOs, what's to stop us deleting monetary UTXOs? What about your UTXOs? What about my UTXOs that are all monetary? What about UTXOs that governments don't like? What about OFAC blacklisted addresses? What about all that? And I'm saying, who cares? Nothing is changing with the cat. The cat means nothing in that regard, because we can delete all those today if we want. We're just not motivated to do it. And this is the simple truth of the matter. The cat does not do anything that is not fundamentally always possible in Bitcoin. We can delete a bunch of UTXOs anytime. If we do the cat, yeah, we set a precedent that we're prepared to, but the mechanism was not newly discovered because of the cat. Guys, UTXOs can be deleted. We can even break the 21 million Bitcoin cap if we all desire it. What protects Bitcoin always is that its users don't want to break it and undermine it. That's what protects Bitcoin. Users are not motivated to delete monetary UTXOs, so they would never activate a fork, whether or not it's proposed today, before something like the cat, even if the cat was rejected or something, or after the cat. Everyone that's in favor of the cat, if you came to them and said, well, you deleted a bunch of UTXOs that you deemed non-monetary or spammy. Now we need you to delete all these UTXOs that the American government doesn't like. And if we don't do it, we're going to make Bitcoin nodes illegal in America. Bitcoiners are not going to go for that. It doesn't matter if it's pre-cat or post-cat. Maybe I'm naive and thinking people are more intelligent than they are, but I don't see it happening. The slippery slope fallacy is a fallacy for a reason. It's because the slippery slope basically says your idea is good and cannot be destroyed on its own merits. Therefore, I need to come up with something similar that would be obviously bad and draw a false equivalence between the two things. Deleting UTXOs is okay if they are obviously, discernibly to the majority of Bitcoiners, trash that's only there for the purposes of tricking people into storing crap that they don't want on their own computers. Deleting UTXOs is morally justified. I don't know if it's worth the fight, because so many people are just going to be instinctively against it, and I don't really care to fight that battle that much. And also, frankly, my association with it and my advocacy is not going to help here. Maybe some people are unsure how they feel, and they agree with my line of logic and reasoning here. But if I come out here strongly and start saying, do the cat, it's the best thing ever, the amount of personal issues and Luke derangement syndrome and my proximity to him via ocean and all that stuff just hurts it. So me advocating any more strongly for it than I am in this video isn't going to help anyone. So that allows me to give my honest opinion and say that I don't really think I'm not motivated to fight for it. For BIP 110, formerly BIP 444, I really do think that is a good idea. It should be way less controversial. But the cat, it does a very different thing. Please bear in mind, they are complementary proposals to my mind. They are not competing proposals. So yeah, that's basically my take on it. I don't have any philosophical issue with it. I don't think it creates a precedent. And anyone that says, well, who decides what UTXOs are non-monetary? My answer to that is conveniently you do, because you can independently attest to the list. And if you disagree with the way that list is being generated, then that just becomes a part of the discussion. Like, I don't want to be overly naive here, but I think with any reasonable amount of discernment, we can look at the UTXO set and say most of this is trash. Not only is 40 or 50% of the UTXO set trash, but the Taproot outputs specifically, almost all of them are trash. 90% of Taproot outputs are complete junk. And we know that because they're all sitting at the dust limit. And we can use these public heuristics the scammers use to further corroborate that all of them are just nonsense created for the purpose of attacking Bitcoin while simultaneously participating in some scam that sits on top of Bitcoin. So people make arguments from a misguided philosophical perspective. They're saying, we can't delete UTXOs. And I'm saying, of course you can, and you have. When the inflation bug was found, we deleted that guy's UTXO because it's just harmful to Bitcoin leaving it there. And I'm intensely in disagreement with armchair philosophers in this space that want to argue that there is no such thing as spam, or that bugs cannot exist because the purpose of software is backward rationalized from whatever it ends up being. It has nothing to do with the intentions of the developers. Right? These are broken philosophical positions that are used to prevent people from healing the network in logical and contained, neatly within certain parameters, as they're incentivized to do. Something like the cat comes from a place of let's disincentivize spammers from clogging up the network. Let's rug pull them, as Nick Szabo said, rug the spammers. And let's send them a very strong message that they need to get out of the space and go somewhere else. And let's reduce the resources required by people that are trying to run a node. All of those are valid things to push for, and there's a bunch of trade-offs with it, but that was the other thing I said in my response to Greg. The trade-offs are... the trade-offs just need to be worth it. No anti-spam mechanism is going to be watertight, but if you abandon it completely, that doesn't work either. And no anti-spam mechanism should start breaking very, very important parts of how Bitcoin functions, because that's just not worth it. So you need to have rational conversations about it. Having a junk folder in my inbox and an inbox folder means sometimes the experience of using email is worse because things I wanted to read ended up in junk. It happens, but it's still on balance a reasonable trade-off to make the whole thing usable. So exactly the same argument then for anti-spam stuff in general. So I don't know what's going to happen with the cat. It may have already had the desired effect by spooking a bunch of scammers and making them think we can't do this stuff on Bitcoin. If we annoy them too much, they will defend themselves and start deleting our UTXOs. That's a very, very valid fear I want to instill in them. But at the same time, a bluff only works if you appear to mean it. And we will only appear to mean something if we actually mean it. So if the cat was to have an activation client released for it, I wouldn't have an issue running it. I hesitate to go any more strong in my advocacy than that for the two reasons that I already stated. One is that my association with it harms the whole thing because of how hated I am by people in Bitcoin that might even like the idea, but just are so utterly, egotistically offended by my existence at this point that will cause them to reflexively hate it. And also just because, there are other probably more realistic things we can activate, like BIP 110. I find BIP 110 to be comparatively non-controversial, and that's got all the way until September before it activates. So there you go. That's my take on the cat. Hopefully I covered the things I wanted to cover in this sort of roundup to the year. I don't think anyone take part in the conversation on the cat. Pay attention to all that's being exposed with the bad actors that are trying to gatekeep the entire conversation and are tying themselves in knots, no pun intended, because of their insistence on bureaucratic adherence that we are barred from partaking in, or he's advocating we be barred from. So yeah, thank you. Merry Christmas, everyone. Hope you enjoyed this video, and I will speak to you in the next one.